Listen, I'm the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar healthcare tech company, and I'm on a podcast talking about how I was at one point feeling suicidal ideation. So from a broader national perspective, stigma is not as great as the accessibility and affordability challenges.
That's Headway CEO Andrew Adams. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Stay tuned to hear how this founder is helping to build a new mental health care system in the U.S. Don't forget to hit that follow button to get new episodes of our show every week. And if you find this conversation, or any others you've heard on the show, valuable, I have a favor to ask. Consider leaving us a review so we can keep bringing you more conversations you love. If you don't know, here's how to leave a review. On Apple Podcasts, go to the Everyday Better page, scroll down to ratings and reviews, and click the number of stars you want to give us. Then, right below that, click Write a Review and add your note to us. On Spotify, go to our page, click the 3 dots next to the settings wheel, and select Rate Show. We so appreciate your feedback, and of course, thank you, thank you, thank you. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually, in relationship to others, and to the world around us. I was in my mid-20s the first time that I decided to go to therapy. I had just moved to New York and I was living on my own. And as I've talked about before on the show, I've dealt with anxiety for most of my life. And sometimes my anxiety is like a low level. It's kind of like the hum of a refrigerator. You can ignore it and move on. But other times it's blaring. It's kind of like an alarm clock that won't stop going off. And after moving to New York and still experiencing this anxiety that felt like it was honestly starting to steal my joy and taking away from my everyday life, I finally went to therapy. And I didn't really know what to expect, but it turned out to be a truly helpful resource in getting a different perspective on what was going on for me and working with someone whose expertise was much greater than my own when it came to anxiety. Now, today, almost a decade later, I still see a therapist. You know, I've taken breaks, I've switched providers, but it's something I've decided to stick with because it's really valuable to me. Now, I want to note that therapy actually isn't the only tool in my toolbox, and if you've listened to the show long enough, you know that I'm a proponent of having multiple things in your toolbox. So I also love coaching. I meditate many mornings. Journaling, I think, is really powerful. Breath work, tapping, and other mindfulness practices that I've learned over the years, and that I think is important to say have also been validated through research. Therapy is just one of the steps in my mental health hygiene routine, but it's an important one. The problem is, it's also the most difficult to access for most of the general population. And my guest today is working to change that. Andrew Adams is the founder and CEO of a company called Headway. His aim is to expand access to mental health care by building out this national network of therapists who accept insurance, which can be really difficult to find. Andrew knows firsthand both how valuable and challenging to access therapy can be. He actually has his own story of moving to New York and struggling with his own mental health issues, as you'll hear in a moment. But in his case, he couldn't get what he needed, a therapist who accepted his insurance. Now he's working on a solution to that problem for everyone. Andrew and I sat down to talk about how perceptions of therapy have changed over the years, the personal growth that he's had to do as his company has expanded to a multi-billion-dollar business, and how he takes care of his mental health today as a CEO. Here's Andrew.
I didn't really know a lot about the mental health care system in this country besides my lens is principally a patient, and as I look at it historically, an often dissatisfied patient at that. My mental health care journey begins when I was a student out at Stanford, over a decade or so ago, and was going through a depression at the time, and ultimately found a therapist that truly changed the trajectory of my life in more than one ways, and indeed in more than one ways. I don't know that I'd be here speaking with you if it weren't for that clinician. I think by some measure saved my life, and ultimately, when I came out here to New York City, the best city in the world, as part of settling down, I tried to find another therapist again. And I totally failed. I couldn't find anybody whom I felt like I could afford, which at that time meant accepted my insurance. And it turns out that that was not a unique problem to me. It was and is the problem in the space. 1 in 4 Americans have a treatable mental health condition like a depression or anxiety or PTSD, but most don't get care. And the number one reason is price. Number one reason is affordability for patients. Meanwhile, most therapists don't accept insurance. So unlike most of the healthcare world, mental health clinicians are not accepting insurance. And so that led to both our mission. Let's build a new mental health care system that everyone can access. And the vision is once you have this connected network of behavioral health clinicians all on a common tech platform, you can build a better, smarter mental health care system that everybody can access.
So you started this process back in your college years. You struggled with depression. You said that your therapist was an incredibly powerful part of your life. Talk to me about how you decided to first go to a therapist.
Yeah. It's a personal story for sure. I was at a point in my life where it was obvious I really needed care. I was really in a crisis moment. I was in a crisis moment where it was really clear based on my sort of level of suicidal ideation and the magnitude of my depression and, a given episode that was a trigger for it. It was really clear I needed to get mental health care. There were even some sort of flare-ups and moments when looking back on it, I was in the midst, even a couple of years before that, initially getting into therapy where, I was mired in the physiological symptoms of depression, of being hard to get out of bed, anhedonia, they're just not finding joy in the things you normally find joy in. So, when I ultimately crossed the threshold into getting the regular care that I needed, I was at a crisis point.
I think it's interesting because you cited that a lot of people who don't get care, and the reason they don't get care is because of cost.
Yep.
And it's in at least some of the circles I've been in, I also think it's because of misconception of what therapy is and what mental health care can do. And I'm curious what your experience was, when you went into therapy and what maybe was surprising about, being in the hands of a mental care specialist.
Yeah, well, again, I think what you're calling attention to is the history of stigma attached to seeing a mental health clinician. And, I think often what one might have thought have been the primary barrier might have been stigma. What really has emerged now is the affordability piece, right? Like, listen, I'm the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar healthcare tech company, and I'm on a podcast talking about how I was at one point feeling suicidal ideation. I think that in and of itself is in some sense a testament to where stigmatization has certainly not in a global uniform manner, but certainly at least in some ways receded. I don't think, we'd be in a climate where maybe a CEO of that kind of company would be able to say that without fear of what are people going to think? What is my board going to think? And I'm honest with my board, my company about, my history of mental health issues and my history of depression. So from a broader national perspective, stigma is not as great as the accessibility and affordability challenges. That being said, I can certainly understand that people vary, people's opinions vary, people's perspectives vary. But I'm proud of the country. I'm proud of the culture that we're in, that I'm talking with you on this podcast, and I'm not worried about what are my investors going to think or what are my therapist customers going to think. In fact, to the extent that I think about what they're going to think, I think they're going to say, hell yeah, I'm even more motivated to work for this guy and work for this company.
Yeah, which I think is incredible. And I hear you on the stigma obviously shifting. I think there are certain maybe demographics or, areas in which there's still a lot of stigma. So I think we probably still have work to do, but it's absolutely shifted. Like it wasn't even something I felt like you could talk about, being someone who experiences anxiety or who's been through depression. It didn't feel like it was really on the table. At least when I was a kid and growing up, it was not a conversation.
No, I mean, I even, my story, again, I'm doing this as a patient, I'm doing this for the patient-oriented mission. I'm doing this with thinking about the family and loved ones who ultimately, fortunately, got care. And so oftentimes I'll talk to the company about my not only my personal history, but I framed it in the context of my family history. My grandfather was on antidepressants longer than I knew antidepressants were invented, right? And it's not something that my father knew until decades after it happened. And I contrast that with, his grandson who's leading a company that everybody knows about Andrew's mental health issues and dealing with depression. Mental health care went from something that was certainly from a consumer, a population, a pop culture, a people perspective not talked about. And that it has translated into this market momentum, this moment where mental health care for insurance companies was something that they heard from their customers, their employers, who in turn are made up of employees. Mental health care is sort of like a nice ancillary, like vision or dental. It doesn't really matter. And so the insurance company perspective typically was responding to their customer needs, who said it didn't really matter and treated it like something, okay, well, deliver what is minimally necessary was what it was, the historical market appetite. And that's totally changed. And so mental health care went from something that didn't matter, an ancillary cost center, deliver what is minimally necessary, to insurance companies hearing this is a top 3 employer concern, something that's totally top of mind. And so every insurance company across the country the past few years has been scrambling to build out a better mental health care offering, to respond to the real market demand of people saying we want something better. Therapists, mind you, of course, want to be able to say to that young Andrew with depression, yeah, but I can totally help you with the depression you're going through. They don't want to have to say, sorry, I don't accept insurance, so you can't afford me. So therapists want to accept insurance, and patients, of course, want to be able to see that therapist that they can afford.
And I mean, you as an entrepreneur, right, and also as someone who started this business because of your challenges with mental health, I'm curious, as you think about other entrepreneurs who are watching you or listening to you, what advice do you have for them and how they manage their mental health? Because what an incredible but also massively can be heavy role to take on.
Yeah, this is what I would say. At some point during the journey of becoming a founder, and if you're like me, you were a first-time founder and first-time manager, the most important person you end up figuring out how to manage is yourself. And, that is not just sort of a glib soundbite to rationalize self-care. It's like truly to deliver the right results, you need to work on yourself. And sort of what I mean by that when I think about that is you can read a lot of books on how to do the basics of being a manager. You can learn and see this is how you run a one-on-one. This is how you run a hiring process. This is how you run a termination process. This is how you run a meeting. At some point, right, you'll learn the basics that can be learned and comprehended pretty quickly. And then you're going to be pushed and pushed and pushed. If you're fortunate like I am to have a company that is growing so fast, it pulls growth out of you. You have to change. You have to be changing and changing. And at some point, right, you're going to be good at things. You're going to get even better at some things. And at some point, the barrier is going to be you. Something about who you are. And so I'm somebody I'm pretty vocal and I'm public about my strengths and weaknesses. One of my strengths is I hold people to high standards. I push on high standards. And, ultimately at some point, the real internal psychology of who I am, the why behind that why was holding me back, because one of the reasons that I held myself to a high standard was a fear of complacency and not, embracing the moment, being present, being connected with people. And so ultimately being a better manager. At some point, there wasn't a book I could read. And at some point, Andrew could really push and drive performance, but he also was appearing and presenting kind of frantic or kind of edgy and people didn't feel as connected to me. And so the most important journey that I've had, for instance, over the past couple of years is being a better manager to myself. And so, when I am in the morning doing my breathwork routine, I am working in some sense because I'm investing in how I show up. And you can read my 360, so what people say about me sort of anonymously now versus 2 years ago. And people feel more energized being around me. They feel more focused, more empowered. And we have a management principle here at Headway that your wake is bigger than your boat, which is the idea of not what you do, but sort of how you say it, the emotional ripples, the implication, ripples beyond you. And so I'll be honest, there's sometimes if I am frustrated with something that's going on in my home life or something, and I show up to a meeting and I'm frustrated, people feel that energy cascades. And the first thing people think is, what am I doing wrong that Andrew's frustrated with me? And that creates anxiety that ripples in turn for their next meetings. Versus if I show up with that positive energy, it really ripples. The other side of that, honestly, is when you're working by yourself, you don't have as much energy to ripple through everybody. So it's the kind of thing that gets more and more important. I think the bigger your organization gets, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
I didn't have a lot of wake to ripple when it was just me. And then when it was just a couple people, they could learn how to deal with it. But when you get a larger organization, when so much more about what I do now is not what I physically do. I am not pushing code anymore. I'm not doing customer support calls all that often, right? But what I'm doing is setting the right context and the right story, and the way in which I say it, the intonation, the focus, all that stuff ends up being really important. And the efficacy of that is as much about what I say as how I say it, and that's as much about how I work on myself. So ultimately, the most important person I think you manage ends up being yourself.
Coming up, Andrew walks us through the things he does besides therapy to protect his mental health. We'll be back in just a few moments. And we're back with Headway CEO Andrew Adams. I'm curious, are there other things that you do aside from, you mentioned breath work in the mornings? Are there other things that you do that you'd recommend to people that have been helpful for at least you?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer this strictly through the narrow prism of my own experience. What has been powerful for me as I've grown, and mind you, I feel fortunate to have grown so much, and that's as much as a flattering statement to myself, but also a statement of how much I needed to grow, and where I've kind of come from, but also the growth of the business, And honestly, I've had a lifetime of mentors, a lifetime of advisors, a lifetime of patience from great employees who have given me feedback and made me better. There is no silver bullet to doing it besides doing it. That being said, tools that I avail myself regularly. I have a great coach who's helpful. I still do see a therapist that's helpful for self-growth. I have a great board of directors who I am straight and I am honest with, and I call when I need help, not when I'm trying to position something and brag about something. I have a company that I've created a dynamic that they give me feedback when I need to be doing better. And it's the kind of thing that by the way, to get a company where I have people who are new employees, entry-level employees that will Slack me or message me saying, "Hey, Andrew, you did this and had this effect on me. It made me feel this way, and I want to feel a little bit differently." And the way you create that environment is to get the feedback is you need to reward it. The best way to create a feedback culture is not to give it, but to reward it appropriately. And so if someone gives you feedback, there is a right response. It's thank you. There's the right two words to say, because someone is risking their relationship with you to say something that could be received in one way or another. And so creating an environment where you grow, create an environment where people help you grow and thank them for it. Thank you for the feedback they give. Shout it out publicly, bring it to your staff meeting, so on and so forth. Bring it to all hands, thank people about it. Create an environment where people want to give you feedback. So, in terms of the tools that I would rely upon, I've worked on breath work. I run every day, has been an amazing mental health boon for me. But I've ultimately feel fortunate and grateful for a culture that exists beyond me that gives me feedback every day how I can be better. And they often give it really, really thoughtfully too. So it inspires me.
I love that. And I love your point about learning how to manage yourself as being a really powerful way to move into the next echelon of becoming a leader and not just a manager. When you were talking about finding a therapist, I'm curious how you have thought about and how you might give guidance for people to find the right match in a therapist, because it's kind of like a dating game sometimes.
Yeah, it's a great question. And rather than give a direct, easy answer, I will give a almost oblique parable. And that in and of itself is the answer. There isn't a straightforward answer. But the oblique parable is, my company Headway, our company Headway, its Delaware C Corp name is still Therapy Match Inc. And I was somebody who had a meager set of data science skills, taking some data science classes at Stanford. I was a good enough computer scientist and engineer to get an internship at Amazon, but not that they'd want me back. So I was a meager engineer, fortunately not doing any more engineering stuff. But when I was starting Headway, and I thought about a way to get more people to get mental health care, I thought, I've got some data science skills. Let me help do some cool, smart matching for people to find the right therapist for them. And what I thought I would find, I thought I'd read some scholarship that would say, psychodynamic therapy works better for these kind of patients. or CBT or Gestalt or interpersonal, works better with these types of patients and these types of conditions. And what I found instead is that among the most prevailing thoughts of what makes a good patient-therapist fit is this tautological theory, the common factors theory, which this is how unsatisfying it is. The best predictor of a good patient outcome is patient-therapist fit. Well, what's the good predictor of patient-therapist fit, right? It's like, as in, it's a tautology, it's ineffable. It almost is saying like a good fit's a good fit.
Yeah.
But really it is kind of like that. And, another parable I would give is, I saw the first psychiatrist I saw through Stanford, had a fancy Ivy League degree and, all the acronyms one could want. And I remember asking her how she would define herself sort of clinically. And she went over all the different paradigms and methodologies that she practices. And then I asked, tell me about a patient that you recommended to somebody besides yourself. And then she sort of drops the sort of academic posture and says, okay, well, it's funny. I remember I had a patient that was like really hip and really cool. And then I introduced her to a therapist friend I had that was really hip and really cool because I thought they'd hit it off. And listen, like it's not to say that sort of like fashion sense is like the most predictive, but I think there's something ineffable that we don't quite know yet that really makes an amazing patient-therapist fit. And that can be discouraging, but that can also be empowering that just figure it out. There's no right answer. And ultimately, again, I hope to get to a world where we know much more. I do hope in partnership with our therapists to be able to get there, to be able to understand at a scale that's never been understood before what makes a great patient therapist fit. The studies that I've read, and again, I say this with a full-throated disclaimer that I'm not a clinician, but every study I've seen shows that psychotherapy works, therapy works. As to which therapy works better than others, is something that seems, from this lay person's perspective, to be highly in dispute, whether it's CBT or psychodynamic or what have you. So.
Got it. But it sounds like what you're saying is, don't give up hope. You can find the right match when it comes to therapy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And, I hope Headway could be a partner for folks in that regard. And one thing I would say about 2025 is I hope we're going to have a much better experience for patients that are looking for the right person for them.
Beautiful. So, Andrew, I'd love for you to complete these 3 statements. Better humans are.
Themselves.
Better work is.
Faster.
And a better world has.
Everything.
Everything. What does that mean?
Even though I have a clinical history of being pessimistic, even though I have a disposition for those that meet me, that I always think what could be better. I'm always anchored on what can be better. Truly in my heart, truly in my soul, truly in my belief about humanity and our civilization, our culture, I think we're tremendously capable. And I think there's truly everything can be solved. Truly.
Love that. Thank you so much for joining me, Andrew. This was great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That was Andrew Adams, founder and CEO of Headway. If you liked this conversation, text it to the first person who comes to mind. It might be just what they needed to hear. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Grace Rubin and Emily Reeves. Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. He makes sure we sound good in the studio. Tim Boland mixed our show. Andres Cardona is our video producer. We get additional support from Alex Kuznetsova and Ali McPherson. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Enrique Montalvo is our executive producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Maya Pope-Chappelle is director of content and audience development. Courtney Koop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and I'll see you next week.